All right, I want to welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont. Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. I want to go to some news and notes from members out there. I'm going to start with Jeff Cohn, who wants to tell us a little bit about his podcast. Jeff, you're up.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, this week on Baseball on BBQ Podcast, dropping on Saturday, we have a fantastic interview with former Dodger GM Fred Clare. It was amazing. Had a nice about hour talk with him. It was fantastic. And the following week, we have the author of this book. It's a Beautiful Day for Baseball, Doug Kirkle, and it's a very interesting book about baseball in the '60s. So tune in, Baseball on BBQ, dropping every Saturday. Thanks, Bruce.
You can grab that in any podcatcher that you've got on Android or Apple products. Now I want to go to a very good friend of mine who I am proud to say is the new chapter chair of the Elysian Fields chapter in New Jersey, my good friend Donna Muscarella, who was in Oakland last week for the funeral dirge, I guess. Donna, what was that like?
So I was there for the last 6 games, which worked out well because my Yankees played in 3 of them. So I got to see the Yankees sweep Oakland. Yankee fans traveled amazingly well for this, as did Texas fans. I was really surprised. It was really sad, but at the same time, it was wonderful to see all the people there sharing stories and bringing multiple generations of families walking into the ballpark together, and people bringing their babies and their toddlers in with headsets on, noise canceling headphones on, so that they could tell them that they were at their favorite place. And from a fan standpoint, like I said, it was really very sad. People cried, people just sat in their chairs and didn't want to move. But from a standpoint of celebrating and appreciating the players and the franchise, not the ownership, there's a difference. It was really, it was an honor to be a part of that.
I still say they don't get to Vegas.
I agree. There is a chance, by the way, that they don't even get to Sacramento. Ooh. Apparently, and don't hold me to this because I have not researched it. This is just what numerous staff members there told me. The Players Association has not yet approved playing in Sacramento.
I have heard that. Yes.
And if in fact that is true, then there is a chance that this team just isn't in transition, but that they're downright homeless.
Oh, man.
So, to be determined.
Oh, brother.
Yeah. I mean, Mark Kotze even said in one of his interviews, this was not, he did speak on the field. I don't know what was televised and what made it out. I tried really hard to stay out of what was being published online because I didn't want to be part of all of the horrible ugliness of ownership. I wanted to keep it from the fan side. But he said in response to a question posed by Jessica Kleinschmidt that he had taken a photo with a gentleman named Gus, who had been a doorman there for the entirety of Kotze's time there as both a player and a manager. And he said that photo will be up in my new office, wherever that office may be. Now, I don't know if Kotze's contract is up. I don't know if that was in response to, I have no idea where we're playing next year, but that's what Kotze said.
Welcome to the circus, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. And it's not the good one that Ringling Brothers said.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I'll tell you what. By the way, Donna, thank you. I appreciate you. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
On to our feature presentation. The summer of 2024 marked the 50th anniversary of 10-cent beer night in Cleveland. Although a popular promotion within minor league baseball, it went wrong in 1974 with a larger than expected crowd that was not there to watch the game. After a full night of shenanigans, the game ended in forfeit with the Indians on the verge of a comeback. Tonight's program from SABR 52, entitled 10-Cent Beer Night, a date that will live in infamy, shows the context of both teams who were terrible and had met a week earlier in a series that included a fight that set the stage for the game, along with the game's aftermath. Vince Guerrieri is an award-winning journalist whose writing also appears regularly in various regional and national magazines and online publications. A native of Youngstown, Ohio, and a graduate of Bowling Green State University, he is the author of 3 books on Ohio sports history. And he's also the secretary-treasurer for the Jack Graney chapter in Cleveland, and he is here tonight to give his presentation. My good friend, Vince Guerrieri, welcome to Northern New England. How are you?
Bruce, thanks for having me. I am doing just fine. It's funny that Donna brought up how nomadic the athletics may end up being. We were talking before the meeting about the Browns' departure in 1995 under, let's say, similar circumstances. And there was actually a scenario that, they were breaking their lease, and it was entirely possible that they could be a lame duck team. But they ended up working out a settlement that was really unique in sports history. Cleveland kept the Browns' history and name and colors, and the team that moved to Baltimore started effectively as an expansion team. But I'm here tonight to talk about 10-Cent Beer Night. Like Bruce said, the 50th anniversary was this June 4th to be precise. And this kind of all germinated with me writing a feature for the 50th anniversary for Cleveland Magazine. I have just included a link to that in the chat so you can peruse it at your leisure. But I have a PowerPoint presentation directed to this, which I will share forthwith. And we will get this show on the road, and it'll be fantastic. Now, the 10-Cent Beer Night, as I said, was in 1974, but we're going to start with the words of John Adams. He was one of the guys that I talked to for the story. If you've ever been to an Indians or Guardians game, you have heard him, even if you haven't always seen him. He was the guy with the drum that was out in the outfield at Cleveland Stadium and then at Jacobs/Progressive Field. He started bringing the drum in August of 1973. He was in the ballpark for 10-Cent Beer Night, and he told me down through the years that 720,000 people have told him they were also at 10-Cent Beer Night. The actual crowd was around 25,000. The stadium was built for about 80,000, so that was not a huge crowd, but by the standards of the day, it was enormous. We're going to start in the 1940s. The Cleveland Indians won the 1948 World Series. This picture is actually taken from the day in 1949 when the Indians were mathematically eliminated from pennant contention. And it was a game, I believe, against the Tigers at Cleveland Stadium. And before the game, the gates opened onto the field, and a horse-drawn hearse came out and made its way out to the outfield. Then they had a very solemn ceremony where they lowered the pennant from the flagpole, placed it in a casket, and as you can see, they had a hole in the ground for the casket. So they said a few words, they shed a few tears, and they buried the casket. To this day, the pennant has never been found, but we know that it was dug up, and we know it was dug up that night. Because years later, when they had the team in town for a reunion, I want to say it was 74 or 75, they were talking to one of the groundskeepers, and they said, "Oh yeah, we dug up the casket that night because Bill Veeck borrowed it from a funeral home, and they wanted it back." So from 1949 to 1953, they won at least, I believe, 88 games. Problem was that the Yankees were just a little bit better every year. Finally, in 1954, the Indians won 111 games, promptly got swept in the World Series by the Giants, and a long, slow decline started not long after that. It got to the point in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s where it was the Indians' fate in Cleveland was downright tenuous. If you were at the conference in Minneapolis, you got a copy of the National Pastime. I actually wrote an article for the National Pastime about all the teams that considered a move to Minneapolis in the 1950s, one of which was the Indians. And in fact, the only reason that they didn't, they could, was that they had a problem with the lease. The city signed a lease with Bill Veeck that said they wouldn't play anywhere but Cleveland Stadium. And they did that because Bill Veeck was rattling the saber about potentially relocating back to League Park, restoring the stadium, expanding the seating capacity, because that was the stadium that the Indians owned. They leased Municipal Stadium. So they inserted a clause that they could only play at Cleveland Stadium, and that really kept them in Cleveland at least into the 1960s. When the lease expired in 1964, they had very serious negotiations with the city of Seattle. And this is actually from when they signed the lease. This is Vernon Stouffer. He was the owner of the Indians. He of the macaroni and cheese and microwave pizza. This is Ralph Locher, who was the mayor of Cleveland at the time. And this here is Gabe Paul, who was with the Indians for many, many years on several occasions. Spent some time in Cincinnati with the Reds. Obviously came to New York with George Steinbrenner as well. And in 1964, the Cleveland Browns won the NFL championship. And in 9 home dates, they actually outdrew the Indians that season. It got to the point where the city's business community urged support for the team. Chamber of Commerce materials talked about buying tickets to keep the Indians in Cleveland. And they actually viewed the team as a civic asset. The team was not very good and continued to not be very good. It got to the point where in 1973, they drew 70-some thousand people for opening day, and that constituted more than 10% of the team's total attendance. They had a deal in place to play home games in New Orleans once the new domed stadium was built there. Obviously, that deal never came to pass. Vernon Stouffer ended up selling the Indians to Nick Maletti. He did not end up selling the Indians to George Steinbrenner, which is another story for another time. And the deal to play home games in New Orleans was canceled shortly thereafter. Like I said, the Indians were not a really good team, so they had to get really creative in promotions. Carl Wallenda walked across the tightrope strung across the roof at Cleveland Stadium, and I'm getting vertigo just thinking about that. That was actually the Friday before 10-cent beer night in June. Evel Knievel made an appearance. He did not jump over anything. This was actually a photo from a different from a racing venue in Northeast Ohio. But he did ride his motorcycle around the stadium. And one of the people I talked to for the Cleveland Magazine story was Milt Wilcox, who was a pitcher for the Indians that year. And he said that Evel Knievel had broken so many bones and injured himself so much that he actually had to kickstart his motorcycle for him. The King in His Court softball exhibition played. They played, actually, they were scheduled to play the night Dick Bosman ended up throwing his no-hitter, which was in July of 1974. And I talked to Dick Bosman, and he said, yeah, I was a little annoyed that I had to stick around and answer questions about my no-hitter because I was missing the King in His Court. My personal favorite promotion is on Mother's Day in 1971. Everyone in attendance got a can of Right Guard deodorant, which was definitely a practical gift. Not sure that's how I'd play it. And of course, there were beer nights. 4 were scheduled in 1974, the first of which was going to be June 4th. Now, I want to talk a little about beer in baseball. It is a tradition that goes back almost as long as the game itself. In the 1800s, there was actually a league referred to as the Beer and Whiskey League because it was peopled with ruffians who would partake of strong drink. In the 1900s, the ballpark menu really got standardized by a guy by the name of Harry Stevens, who is from, he's from England, but he ended up not far from here in Niles, Ohio. There's actually a park named for him there, and they have a festival for him every summer. But he got the concession job for a lot of the National League teams. And then when the American League came into existence in the early 1900s, they put a lot of teams in the same cities, and it was a kind of a natural thing for him to take on the concessions there. So the menu became standard. Hot dogs, peanuts. When Harry Stevens died, one of his obituaries said that that he parlayed a bag of peanuts into $1 million fortune. Ice cream, pop, and of course beer. Bill Veeck had people coming to the ballpark just for beer. We got an ad here from Blatz. Bill Veeck was, before he owned the Indians in the late 1940s, he owned the Milwaukee Brewers when they were a minor league team. And he had an agreement in place with Miller to provide beer at the ballpark. And at the time, Blatz and Schlitz were the big brewers in Milwaukee. Miller was actually a distant third. It was wartime, so there was rationing. And people ended up coming to the ballpark just for the beer because it was the only place in town that you could get it. Bill Veeck tells the story in his Hustler's Handbook. He said that Miller said they wanted to renegotiate the deal, and they asked if they had to make all the beer or if they could just supply it. And he said, you can just supply it. And he said, and every fly-by-night brewery started delivering beer to the ballpark. And I'm sure that right after the war, they went back to making shampoo. Following his adventures in Cleveland, he ended up selling the Indians to pay for his divorce. Bill Veeck owned the St. Louis Browns, really in their last couple of years in St. Louis. And there was a moment when it seemed like if one of the teams was going to leave St. Louis, it was going to be the Cardinals. Their owner had gone to prison for income tax evasion, and the team's future in St. Louis was shaky. But then up stepped Anheuser-Busch Brewery, and they bought the team, and Bill Veeck realized that he was not going to be able to compete with them, so he took off. Now they bought Sportsman's Park. I believe Bill Veeck's exact words was they bought Sportsman's Park for $1 million and all the repairs they could find. And they said, we want to rename the stadium now that we own it. We want to call it Budweiser Park. And Major League Baseball said, you can't call it Budweiser Park. You can't name the team after, you can't name the stadium after a product. And he said, well, what about Wrigley Field? He said, well, Wrigley's the family name. They said, okay, so we'll name the stadium Busch Stadium. They said, that's fine. And then 3 years later, they came out with Busch Bohemian Beer. So beer has definitely been a long-standing part of the baseball experience. Now, before the Indians and the Rangers met for the infamous 10-cent beer night, they met a week prior in Texas. And I actually found a little video of that, and I can make it work on this computer, and that is precisely what I'm going to do. Now, before the game, Lenny Randle had popped off and said that Gaylord Perry, who won the game the night before, was washed up and he wouldn't still be in baseball without the spitter. And Milt Wilcox said Milt Wilcox was scheduled to pitch that night, and Gaylord Perry told him, if I was pitching tonight, Lenny Randle would go down every time he came up to bat. I wouldn't hit him, but I'd knock him down. And that is the background to what I'm about to share with you. And this is Lenny Randle at bat. Milt Wilcox throws behind him. Randle lays down a bunt. That's Wilcox coming over. And things went just about the way you could expect. This was, by all accounts, a real fight, not your standard baseball fight with some jawing, some shoving, and maybe a couple of haymakers. It was a knockdown, drag-out fight. Dugouts cleared. I mean, it got violent. One of my favorite stories is Buddy Bell said, yeah, I was out there and Billy Martin came up and it looked like he was going to swing at me. And he realized who I was. And he had played baseball with my father. And he said, I can't hit you. Now, this is Dave Duncan. He was a catcher for the Indians at the time. And apparently a fan threw something that hit him. And he was not thrilled about that and decided going up into the stands was going to be his course of action before he was discouraged from that behavior. So following the game, Billy Martin was asked, are you worried about reprisals when you go to Cleveland next week? And Billy Martin said, no, I'm not, because there's not enough fans for me to worry about. And that was probably a true statement. I mean, I can't diminish that, but that was not something that a lot of people wanted to hear. Chief among them, come on, machine. Chief among them, Pete Franklin, who was the proto sports talk host in Cleveland. His autobiography was called "You Could Argue, But You'd Be Wrong." He was on 3WE, which he boasted could be heard in 38 states and half of Canada. He was definitely a confrontational person. He was the guy who came up with the "I Hate the Yankees" hankies in Cleveland, and he is probably most notable for his feud with Ted Stepien, who actually was a minority owner of the Indians in the early 1970s, but became more notorious for his ownership of the Cleveland Cavaliers in the late 70s. And he was not a very good owner. And in fact, their rivalry was so heated that Stepien actually pulled the Cavs from 3WE and moved them to another radio station in a fit of pique. Ted Stepien actually talked about moving the Cavaliers to Toronto, made an appearance on a Toronto radio show to talk about it, and they took a call from Pete Franklin, who did not identify himself as Pete Franklin. And they put him through to Ted Stepien. And the first thing he said was, "Am I talking to the dumbest man in pro sports?" And the conversation kind of went downhill from there. So there were a lot of people who were upset about Billy Martin's remarks. Joe Tate, who was one of the broadcasters for the Cavs, said, I want to see a real good turnout, and I want people to be able to stick it in Billy Martin's ear. There were obviously editorial cartoons in, I believe, both of Cleveland's daily newspapers at the time, the Press and the Plain Dealer, talking about this. And generally, there were a lot of people who were riled up for the Rangers to come to town the following week. I want to take a minute and talk about the Rangers. I mentioned that the Indians were actually considering a move to Minneapolis in the 50s. They didn't move. The Washington Senators moved to Minneapolis and became the Twins. They were replaced with an expansion team who became the second Washington Senators, because baseball decided that they wanted to have a team where Congress and the president could go to the ballpark and have photo ops. Because if they were not able to do that, they would start thinking about things like, why does baseball have a reserve clause and an antitrust exemption? The Senators were bought by Bob Short, who had no real tie to the Washington area, and he ended up moving the team to Dallas. That move was met with some displeasure and a forfeit. There were actually 3 forfeits in the 1970s that involved essentially fan riots on the field, and this was the first of them. The Rangers were not a great team either. Mike Shropshire covered the team for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and the book he wrote about the Rangers was called Seasons in Hell. Their manager, when they moved to Texas, was Ted Williams. They hired Ted Williams in 1969. He was actually manager of the year that year. Had a pretty good year with Washington. By the time they moved to Texas, he was totally checked out. He left. They hired Whitey Herzog. Whitey was kind of annoyed that he got passed over when Gil Hodges died. Whitey was a coach with the Mets, and Yogi Berra was hired to replace Gil Hodges. So Whitey Herzog left and took the Rangers job. And then all of a sudden, Billy Martin came available. Billy Martin was regarded as a brilliant tactician. One of the people I talked to for this story was Mike Hargrove, and he just raved about Billy Martin, about how smart he was, about how he seemed to be 3 steps ahead of everybody else on the field. and all he wanted from you was to bust your ass for him. But Billy Martin had an alarming tendency to wear out his welcome everywhere he went. His first managing job, was with the Minnesota Twins in 1969. They won the division, and he got fired shortly thereafter because he wore out his welcome. He ended up in Detroit, won a division there, got fired shortly thereafter because he couldn't stop getting in fights with people at Lindell AC or people on the team. And Bob Short famously said, "I would fire my grandmother for a chance to hire Billy Martin," which prompted Whitey Herzog to say, "Well, I guess I'm grandma." So Billy Martin got hired as the manager of the Texas Rangers, and he was always, let's say, combustible. So we have this game on the 4th of June. It was against a team where there was some bad blood. The bad blood was being encouraged by local media in Cleveland. If you're one of the people who believe in that kind of thing, it was a full moon. It was the beginning of June, so school was letting out for the year. So you had a lot of people who didn't have anywhere else to go the next day. And of course, beer was 10 cents. This picture is of Billy Martin blowing kisses to the fans before the game even started. Mike Shropshire said it was a stew of alcohol, adrenaline, and testosterone. Things started out relatively innocuously, at least compared to what would come later. As you can see, this was a streaker on the field, one of several that particular evening. This guy was in such a hurry, he didn't have time to get both of his socks off. There was a lot of gratuitous nudity involved in the game. There were stories of a father and son that ran out to second base between innings and mooned the crowd. There were several streakers that night. At least one woman came down onto the field and tried to kiss one of the umpires. And it was all kinds of drunken shenanigans. There was a lot of people running on the field. It was described to me by several people. They said between the first time between innings, there were about 5 people that ran from foul pole to foul pole. And then at the next inning break, there was about 15 people that ran from foul pole to foul pole. Then the next inning break, it was about 50 from foul pole to foul pole. And then all of a sudden, you were getting dozens of people running out from foul pole to foul pole between innings. The crowd got drunker and rowdier, and things got a little more out of hand. Players' wives and girlfriends were kind of shepherded out of the stadium in about the 6th inning. Fans were throwing firecrackers onto the field and in some instances into the dugout. I don't know if you guys have ever actually been to Cleveland Stadium, but they did not have a bullpen per se. The warm-up mounds were actually right next to the dugouts. And it got to a point where they couldn't warm up on the warm-up mounds if they were bringing in relief pitchers. And everybody brought in a couple of relief pitchers in this particular game. They had to go up onto the mound and warm up. Mike Hargrove was playing first base for the Rangers. He was a rookie that year. He said later on, "Yeah, that was my first trip to Cleveland, and they did not make a good impression on me." But he said while he was playing first base, somebody threw a gallon jug of Thunderbird wine onto the field. And he said he kicked it over to the edge of the field and hoped that one of the grounds crew would get it up. And he said, "I was really worried because I realized that a fan had taken it back, and I was scared I was going to see it again." In the meantime, a pretty good game was developing. The Rangers were leading 5-3 in the 6th inning, or 5-3 going into the 9th. They were leading 5-1 in the 6th inning. Ken Ashpermani was the manager of the Indians. He sent up 3 straight pinch hitters. They all got hits. All of a sudden, it is a tie game in the bottom of the 9th. And then a fan ran out into right field and tried to grab Jeff Burrows' baseball cap. The fan fell down. Jeff Burrows fell down. The field was crowned, so Billy Martin only got a partial view of what was going on. But what he saw was Jeff Burrows fall down, and he said, "They are attacking one of my players." He said, "We have to go get him." At which point he pulled a bat out of the bat rack, led his team in what was described to me as a cavalry charge out into the outfield. It was at this point that the Indians said, "This guy could get hurt. We should probably go help them." And then all the Indians players and coaching staff ran out onto the field as well. And then before too long, everybody was on the field. It was a full-scale melee. Punches were being thrown. Ken Aspromani was the manager of the Indians at the time, and the next day he talked about what a dangerous scene it was. I talked to him for the story. It appears that time might have dulled his reaction to it. He says, yeah, there were lots of people on the field throwing punches, but none of them were in any real condition to throw a punch. The bases were all picked up and stolen. People were climbing up the foul poles. There was no way order was going to be restored, and the game was ruled a forfeit in favor of the Rangers. As you might imagine, the reaction was exactly what you thought it would be. Wayne Minshew of the Atlanta Constitution said, how utterly stupid, how insane, how disgusting. Dave Anderson of the New York Times called it the beer that made Cleveland infamous. Dick Young of the New York Daily News said, crowds go there to tank up, not to watch baseball. What do the lords of baseball expect? This is Indians owner Ted Bonda. He viewed the night as a success because it drew twice your standard Tuesday afternoon or Tuesday night crowd, and he wanted to have it again. And they let him. There was another 10-cent beer night a month later. Nobody remembers that one because nothing went wrong. They learned their lesson. They had only the first 2 beers were 10 cents, and you would get voucher tickets for your 10-cent beer. And then after that, they would be regular price, which at the time was 65 cents. They also tripled security and brought in off-duty police officers and sheriff's deputies, something that they did not have in any great number at the initial one in June. And this is the story from the next day's Cleveland Press. I don't know if you guys can read it, but the lead is, it was so quiet you could hear the foam breaking down in your cup. And this was still a promotion that would continue on, maybe not necessarily in Cleveland. I think the following year they had a 15-cent beer night, but that it was still a promotion that you would see in dribs and drabs over the next couple of years. Now, I mentioned that there were 3 big promotions that resulted in fan riots. And the third one was Disco Demolition Night. It was exactly what it sounded like. If you got a ticket, if you brought in a disco record, you could get in for 98 cents. And the idea was that the disco records would be collected and they would be exploded on the field between games of a doubleheader. And I can play the video of that as well.
After the first game, the crate of disco records exploded as planned. What happened next was not planned. Thousands of fans immediately rushed the field. Some lit fires. The batting cage was destroyed. The field badly damaged. Multiple fights broke out. Beck got on the PA and pleaded for the fans to return to their seats. They didn't. 39 people were arrested. The umpires declared the field unplayable and called off the second game. What?
Now, one of the people I talked to, like I said, for disco or for 10-cent beer night was Milt Wilcox, who was supposed to start the second game of the doubleheader for Disco Demolition Night for the Tigers, who was the opponent at the time, and he said, I don't know what they used for that explosion, but they used too much of it. He said the concussion from the blast almost knocked him down. Now, 10-cent beer night, the crowd was 25,000 in a stadium built for 80,000. The crowd was estimated at Disco Demolition Night between 50,000 and 60,000, and there were accounts that there were still thousands more trying to get in. I've heard stories that the turnstiles actually spun off their stands because so many people wanted to get in during the game. But like Bruce Springsteen said, someday we'll look back on this and it will all seem funny. The 10-cent beer night started to take on mythical significance. It was all part of the great narrative of Cleveland in the 1970s, summed up by a very popular T-shirt that said, "Cleveland, you've got to be tough." Tim Russert later bragged about being there. He was a student at, I believe he was at Marshall Law School at the time, and his exact words were, "I went to the game with $2. You can do the math." Drew Carey said one of his friends was there, got hit in the head with a beer bottle, and bragged about it for years. And then T-shirts started being sold. This was the 50th anniversary edition that came out this year from Homage. I had to buy a pair for my in-laws, whom I don't think have ever been to a Cleveland baseball game in their lives. But it was, I talked to the founder of Homage for the story, and he said early on, we didn't have licenses for any of the teams. So what we would do is we would pick out moments like this, like 10-cent beer night, like the Pine Tar game between the Yankees and the Royals, or the Bean Brawl between the Braves and the Padres, and make shirts from that fans would be able to recognize. And it was a little bit of fan service at play as well. That would allow them to, get some real credibility with it. And obviously, this was 15 years ago, and they're still selling 10-cent beer night T-shirts. That is but one of the weird moments in Cleveland sports that is in my book of the same name. It is the longest book I've ever written, but that is the extent of my presentation. And I will happily entertain any questions you might have.
If you would like to ask a question of our presenter, Jeff Guerrieri, tonight, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button, and then you will see raise hand. Click raise hand, and you are in line to ask your question, and Jeff Cohen knows what to do. Jeff, unmute, my friend. You are up.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and great presentation, Vince. I just want, my only question is, did the commissioner do anything during this time? I mean, I know the game was forfeited, but did they have any other repercussions for the Indians during that time?
No, actually, there really wasn't. The one big change is it got to the point this was when they decided that all promotions were not the exclusive domain of the team. They had to get league approval for any promotion that happened after this.
Thank you.
They didn't need league approval for a promotion until 1974.
Well,
really?
No, I mean, promotions were still felt
Wow.
relatively novel. I mean, you didn't have a whole lot of giveaways, I think, until the 60s.
That just strikes me as nuts, because they're just looking at 8, 10, 12 owners saying, yeah, you guys know what to do. And I'm not sure many of them did. Gosh. Oh, who else has questions for Vince Guerrieri this evening? I want to ask him about the book as well.
Okay.
Tell me a little bit about that book, where it can be obtained, and what's on the pages.
Sure. The book is Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports. It is out through Gray Publishing. I've just put their link in the chat. So in
Perfect.
case you are so inclined, it is available at all of the usual suspects as well: Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Books A Million, whatever. And as the title indicates, it is Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports, basically from the 1800s to the present. One of the ones I talk about, which has obviously gotten a lot of play in the last 4 months or so, is the Cleveland Spiders of 1899. And the White Sox gave them a run for their money for a while, but they still reigned supreme as the worst team ever in Major League Baseball. They went an astounding 20 and 134. What is really remarkable to me is 101 of those losses were on the road. Now, then as now, what happened is a team had the same number of road games as home games, but the Spiders were so bad that teams were saying, we are not coming to Cleveland because we can't recoup our travel expenses. They were actually referred to in some press coverage as the Exiles for that reason, because they kept going on the road.
Oh, Lord. The Cleveland Exiles. I can see it now. Oh no. Well, there's an old saying in baseball: wait till next year. I don't think the Sox are going to improve. I hate to say.
I mean,
And
I don't know what to tell you. It is I feel like we ran out of superlatives to talk about how terrible that team is.
right? I mean, it was unfathomable to watch, and I actually tuned into that White Sox game when they lost 120 because I mean, Chicago Saber is gonna strangle me in Dallas next year. But I'm like, you guys are this close. You got to do this now, and just to watch that team play 2 games, lost 120 and 121, and I'm saying I could start for these guys. Holy moly, the brainless errors and I now know what it was like to watch the 62 Mets. That's all I can say. I mean, really, I'm a little young for that, but let's go to my friend Gary Joquin. Gary, how are you?
Oh, pretty good here in Beaverton, Oregon.
You're up.
Hey, I was curious about the tale of the tape and trying to put this 10-cent beer night into perspective, like comparing it to the Pistons' Malice in the Palace. At the 10-cent beer night, how many arrests were there? How many injuries were there? Suspensions? What happened?
Well, there were no suspensions, basically because I feel like everybody realized that the teams were acting, out of regard for their own safety. Because the contemporary coverage the next day indicated that they actually were concerned for their well-being, and in the case of the Indians, they were concerned for the opposing team's well-being. 9 people were arrested. I couldn't tell you about the disposition of any of the charges. Fortunately, nobody was really seriously injured. There's actually a fairly famous picture of Tom Hilgendorf, who was a relief pitcher for the Indians at the time, actually bleeding from a head wound because somebody threw something that hit him. But it was not fortunately, it was not severe enough that laughing about it would be in really poor taste.
Yeah, at
Go.
the other end of the spectrum, I just have one other question. I'm a teetotaler, so I've never bought a beer in a ballpark. What kind of safeguards are there in place today? I've heard, say, for example, I think 7th inning is when beers are last sold. What kinds of safeguards are there in place today?
Well, and that's a real big one. Obviously it is. I would say that drinking in general is taken far more seriously than it was taken in the 1970s. Obviously, DUIs are treated with far more severity now than they were then. But there are safeguards in place. There are usually you can't usually buy. They usually cap how many beers you can buy in one trip to the concession stand. They cut you off after the 7th inning, and generally drinking responsibly is emphasized more than it would have been before. Because at this particular game, I believe the only limit was you could only buy 6 beers at a time. And unfortunately, there were some instances, like they parked the beer trucks out in the outfield. And there were some instances where they were overrun. And it sounded like some of them became self-serve.
Self-serve? I just processed that. Self-serve?
Yes.
Oh man.
Like nobody, there was the sales staff were overwhelmed and ran off, and people were kind of left to their own devices.
Oh my gosh. Holy moly. Yeah, they have the limits on how many beers you can buy at a trip to the concession. In some ballparks, I think it's 2.
It's lower than 6 now.
It's far fewer than 6 now, that's for sure. But what grabs me is, and I'm a teetotaler as well, the cups for beer just keep getting bigger. And what do I know? Joe Ross, you're up. Joe, how you doing?
Okay, thank you. I got several things. First, Vince, great presentation. I loved it.
Thank you.
And I do thank you for being here, as a matter of fact. The second has nothing to do with this, but I do have to, or want to, give a public thank you to Bruce and Molly for the in-person meeting of last week. They did a hell of a job, and Bruce, thank you very much.
We appreciate that.
Wonderfully.
We appreciate that.
And I think everybody should know that you did it wonderfully.
Thank you.
I think you mentioned it, Vince, but the baseball rule today is you can't order more than 2 beers at a time. Theoretically, that's for you and the person who's with you, but I doubt that that's really the case. The other thing, and I wasn't going to mention this, Bruce, about the Red Sox, because
buckle up, folks. Here we go.
If you remember, I told you about halfway through the season they weren't going to make the playoffs, and all I got from you was grief over it. But I was right, as usual, on that. But I found the thing that's important, or that was interesting. A writer for the Boston Herald wrote, because they won the last game, they ended up in 3rd place in the American League East. Now, 2 things. I haven't figured out what good that does you, since only the first 2 make the playoffs at least. And, when I read that, I said, well, I can kind of refer to them as the next to last in the American League East rather than 3rd place, which has no connotation whatsoever. So they were the next to last in the American League East.
Anything else for Vince Guerrieri this evening? He's giving us one of the best from SABR 52. Oh, we got more Donna Muscarella. You are up.
Hey, Vince, I was just wondering if you, in the course of researching this, found anybody who links in a positive way the idea of 10-cent beer night to the Thirsty Thursday promos that are so prominent now in minor league baseball.
In
the
a
dollar
positive
beers.
way, no.
Well, right. That's why it's like, I wonder, it's like, okay, with such negative connotation attached to 10-cent beer night, the idea of, dollar beers today at minor league ballparks it's a common theme for promos for them. So I was just wondering if like, it seems like it wouldn't be based on the negativity surrounding 10-cent beer night, but yet it's a thing that gets people into the gates repeatedly. Similar concept.
Well, I mean, and even now too, on Friday nights, the Guardians would have a thing where, they'd have the pregame party where you could get $2 cans of Miller Lite, but it's only before the game. You can only buy 2 at a time, and you can only get them before the game. So, that's that kind of backstops any real shenanigans. Yeah. Although one of the things that I neglected to mention is it sounded like there were many controlled substances the night of 10-cent beer night. Dick Bosman and Larry McCoy, who was an umpire that night, both told me that they got a contact high going out onto the field that night. There were a lot of people there who had already engaged in some other controlled substances.
No way. I
Right?
can't believe it. I can't believe it.
The 70s. What are the odds?
Right. And I'm going to speak to Donna's point about minor league baseball and Thirsty Thursdays and whatnot. When I was working in minor league ball, if there was one night I hated working, it was Thirsty Thursday. Oh my goodness. Jeez. Dixie Tarango, how you doing, my friend?
Fine. In keeping with the genre, I've never had a beer anywhere at any time.
Perfect. All right,
And
you're part of the club. We appreciate that.
And Joe, it took you to mid-season to figure out these clowns were not going to make the playoffs. I said on opening day they'd be lucky to play 500.
No, that's when I brought it up, and Bruce gave me all kinds of grief.
Vince, are the Guardians for real, or are they going to be out soon?
Well, they're not going to be out for at least a week because they don't start until the division series. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like they have outperformed expectations. Obviously, their bullpen is probably the strongest in the big leagues. Starting pitching is kind of shaky. And the problem with the lineup is you got a lot of people who've got a lot of pop, but you've also got a lot of real streaky hitters. There was a period in I want to say about the middle of August when I mean it looked like they were in free fall. They were able to right the ship, but and unfortunately they're probably going to end up playing. Well, they're definitely going to end up playing either the Astros, who really had the team's number for like the last 4 years, and even longer if you go back and you're just talking about the playoffs, or the Tigers, who are very quickly becoming the team nobody wants to face. I mean, what they have done in the last month has been ridiculous. So I don't know. I'm going to go see him next Monday, and hopefully I go home happy.
There you go. Buckle up, everyone. It's time for Karen Holler. And Karen, you're up.
Hi, I
There you
have
go,
a
girl.
question about how you went about getting the information for this book. It's wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you. I was very fortunate for 10 Cent Beer Night. There are still a lot of people who are still around for it. I can't remember where I read it, but somebody said the 50th anniversary is the last big anniversary where a lot of the people who actually remember it or were there for it were around. Actually, I believe they said that in reference to the 50th anniversary of the Kent State shootings a few years ago.
Yep.
Unfortunately, plans for the big commemoration were kind of washed away by the plague, but there were still a lot of people around that I could talk to. There were a lot of people that were really easy to find because one of the things, like I said at the beginning, 720,000 people have claimed to have been at 10 Cent Beer Night. And I do have, there were people that I heard who said, oh yeah, I was there. And I'm going, all right, I got to file this one away. But, I found obviously the box scores on Baseball Reference. So I started trying to track down as many of the players as I could for that. And one of them, I actually did a book appearance. The book came out at the end of 2022. I was doing a talk at a local library in early 23. And a guy came up to me and says, I was at 10 Cent Beer Night. I says, really? He says, yeah, I was a Cleveland police officer. They sent me there. And I'm going, all right, I need this story. And he's the guy I led off the Cleveland Magazine story with. He said, we got a call. All units proceed to Cleveland Stadium. There's a riot in progress. And he doesn't know what's going to happen because Cleveland in the 70s could get kind of scary. He said, we come up off the Shoreway on the East 9th Street and 2 naked women ran out in front of my car.
Oh, Lord.
And he said, oh, it's going to be that kind of a riot.
Oh, no.
Okay, well,
Joe Ross,
thank
you're
you.
up.
Quick observation, the 700 and something thousand people that attended an event in a stadium that holds, what did you say?
75,000, give or take.
Yeah, well, that's close. 75, 750, same thing.
Right.
Reminds me of all the stories you get when you talk about who was in the park when all the big home run hitters set whatever record they set. And if they could put them in the park, I'd like to own that club for just that one day.
Right. And there's one event like that for every city. In Pittsburgh, it's the Immaculate Reception. In Green Bay, it's the Ice Bowl, but there's always that one event that everybody says they were there for. And 10 Cent Beer Night actually wins the silver. The gold is Len Barker's perfect game in 81.
Oh, yeah.
Hilarious because I think the crowd there was like 7,500.
Last Raps is Gary Joke when you're up.
Yeah, this is just a fun thought. Honestly, when I heard that they'd been renamed to the Guardians, I thought the name was kind of lame. But it just occurred to me, Has Cleveland hosted any Guardians of the Galaxy promo nights? That's something I might go to.
Honestly, I don't know. Obviously they take the name from the Guardians of Traffic. There is a bridge right by Progressive Field. It links Carnegie to Lorraine Road in Ohio City, and it was this big, beautiful public works project in the late 20s, early 30s, actually right around the same time that they were building Cleveland Stadium as well. And they have these great Art Deco pylons that have come to be called the Guardians of Traffic, and that is the inspiration for the team name.
And if you watch the opening scene of the movie Major League with Charlie Sheen, you can see those.
That is true.
Dixie's sliding into home real quick here. Dixie, you're up.
You're muted.
You're muted, Dix. Sorry.
But actually, while we're talking about Major League and those opening credits, you can also see the church with the onion domes where they had the wedding at the beginning of the Deer Hunter.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Dixie's unmuted. Go.
Vince, is there anything going on at League Park now?
Actually, yes. League Park was turned over to the city. They tore down pretty much the entirety of the stadium except for the one building at the corner of East 66 and Lexington. They finally restored it. About 10 years ago, it reopened. It is an artificial turf field with the same dimensions and configuration as when the Indians played there. You can actually rent it for games. They'll have high school games there. They'll have college games there. They'll have rec league games there. But the building at the corner of East 66 and Lexington is the home of the Baseball Heritage Museum, which is a really interesting collection of memorabilia related to Cleveland baseball. Not just the Indians, but also Negro leagues and sandlot baseball and things like that. Because Cleveland was a really big center for sandlot baseball.
All right, one more. Molly, you're up.
I just wanted to check with Paul. Paul, did you try to ask a question earlier, or did I mishear you?
Paul, you're on mute. You've got to unmute yourself before you speak. Bottom left.
Oh, it's back. I muted and unmuted and whatever. I wanted to ask Vince kind of an opinion question. I don't know whether, because I haven't read the book yet, but the question is along the lines of Billy Martin. I mean, Martin has been known over the years as a very volatile person. And I'm wondering, Vince, if he doesn't pick up the bat and lead the charge out to rescue Burroughs, do you think that if he didn't do that, that thing wouldn't have escalated as much as it already had, or was it immaterial on what Martin did?
That is a really good question. And I'll tell you what, I talked to at least one person who worked for the Indians who said Billy Martin knew exactly what he was doing. That there were people who said he did that because he knew that they were going to lose that game. And he kind of hoped that, by doing that one way or another, that result would change.
Yeah. Interesting. I talked to Mike Kilkenny, who pitched in the major leagues and was with the Tigers when Martin was the manager, and Kilkenny now has passed away. But I asked him about playing with the Tigers under Martin, and he said, I disliked the man. You can say everything you want about what a brilliant tactician was, but he wanted to call the pitches. The pitchers did not like him in Detroit. Mm-hmm. And I refused to
go. He ended up getting in a fight with one of them.
That's right. And he said, I got traded the next day. He said, when I came to the ballpark, all my clothes was sitting right outside the stadium where the ball players come into the parking lot. He said he wouldn't even allow me back into the ballpark. He said, so I never liked the man. I don't think he was as great a technician as people think he is. But, that's just one guy. But no, I just wondered. But I appreciate.
He was one of those guys. Like I said, he always wore out his welcome, and it really sounded like there was he had a shtick that would grow thin very quickly, Like, you know, it seemed like he was the Tigers and the Twins got rid of him, you know, probably right before things would have went downhill. Obviously, he was with the Yankees, what, 5 times? And you know, he was only in Texas for a couple of years as well. But it was, you know, and obviously Billy Ball, I mean, he wore out his entire starting pitching rotation in Oakland. So, you know, I feel like there's something to what he said, but he was one of those guys that in a short term would get results.
Yeah, I imagine he was difficult to play with, and you know, maybe we could parallel him with Leo DeRocher, because DeRocher was very difficult to play with too.
Well, what's really funny about both of those guys is at one point, one of the hallmarks in Cleveland sports is that things were so bad for so long that there was always this idea that there was somebody waiting in the wings that would fix everything.
Pardon me just a moment, just to interrupt just a moment. Bill Nolan just put something in the chat. Pete Rose is dead.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I just saw that. My son told me that too. Yeah.
My phone just buzzed with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Horrible. He'll never know if he got into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, but he's one of those guys. It's like Armando Galarraga's not perfect game. Everybody knows who Pete Rose is, even if he didn't get into the Hall of Fame, possibly because he didn't get into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very true.
But in the early 2000s, it was Bill Cowher. When Bill Cowher left Pittsburgh, they said, "Oh yeah, he's going to come to Cleveland and fix everything." In the 1980s, there was coverage that said, "Oh yeah, Billy Martin, he's going to come to Cleveland, he's going to fix everything." In the late 1950s, they said, "Oh, Leo DeRocher, he's going to come to Cleveland and fix everything." And in fact, Frank Lane, and this is another story that's in the book, Frank Lane fired Joe Gordon with the idea that he was going to bring in Leo DeRocher. He couldn't bring in Leo, so they had to bring Joe Gordon back.
How long did Lou Boudreau manage the Indians? That would be 50s also, eh? Sometime in that era?
40s. He started out
okay.
I believe it was 42. And in 1950, he was fired as a manager and given his release as a player, and that's when he landed in Boston, I believe.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Well, this one's been fun, man. I got to tell you, Vince, you're great. Thanks a lot for doing this.
My pleasure. I insist.
Now, next week, October 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern, we're going to have another great friend of mine stopping by. Maxwell Cates will be joining us to give his Sabre 52 talk. The mayor was the salesman, Charles Bronfman, I can never pronounce that, and the Montreal Expos, 1969 to 1990. Max is an authority on Canadian baseball, especially the Expos, and he gives a great presentation. You're not.
I remember going to his. It really was a very interesting presentation.
Yeah, he was great, and he's going to be great next week. I hope we're going to have a big crowd for him. The link to sign up for that is in the Sabre events calendar. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please subscribe and like our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you are not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community, offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom. Sabre boasts more than 35 different research communities, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabre.org/join today. Vince, I'm proud to know you. Thank you very much for doing this.
Oh, you flatter me.
I'm truthful. I can't wait to see you in Dallas. Let's get everybody out of here. Have a good night, everybody. We'll see you next week.